Hello, and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. Well, today I have a very special episode for you. Previous show guest and great friend of mine, Dr. Emma Cahill-Marone, is the host today, and the topic is all about art history, so I can't wait to share this one with you. I hope you enjoy it.
The Tudors Dynasty podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Emma Cahill-Marone. Today I am joined again by Alejandro Vergara-Sharp, who is the Senior Curator of Flemish and Northern Schools paintings at the Prado Museum in Madrid. Alejandro first came to the show last summer to talk about his book that he was publishing then in English, What is Quality in Art Here. There's an episode on that, so if after this you're still thirsty for more Renaissance and Baroque art, that's out there too, and you can check that out. But today he joins us to talk about his latest book. He gave me a copy of last month at the Prado Museum when we met there, about a fascinating topic about Clara Peeters, a fascinating woman artist who lived and worked in Antwerp in the first half of the 17th century. And he was the one to do the first exhibition on her art in 2017. And he gave me a copy of it and I read it and it was amazing. So today I am joined by him to talk about this fascinating woman and her time. But I think this book, Alejandro, is published in 2 different editions. Am I right?
That's right, Emma. Hi, thank you, and hi to all of you. You're acting as my agent, which I really appreciate.
Yes, it's a good book. It's a great book.
You're right. The Lund Humphreys, which is a great English publisher, very exacting. It was great to work with them. The peer review readers and the editors of the collection, I was very impressed by how they work. But they have a collection called Illuminating Women Artists, and that's the edition that you just showed. The rights of the book for the American market belonged to Getty Press or Getty Publications. So it's just a different design of the cover and so on, right? But it's the same book. So I think if you're in the UK or rest of the world, it's Lund Humphreys, and if you're in the US, it's Getty Publications. I think that's the way they divide it. But anyway, different cover, both paintings at the Prado, and that leads me to to think about why I devoted some time to this artist. When one works in a museum, you come from an academic background. We all do. You do your study, college, and your PhD. I worked in academia for a while, and then I ended up at the Prado in Madrid. And you're a little more driven there by what is around you, what collection you have a responsibility over, than you are when you're working at your office, where you can choose more freely, I guess. I would say this is, to my mind, I was going to say it's an advantage at museums, but it's not. It's just a different thing. Working very much based on objects is a great thing, but it also is a great thing to be more, intellectual and conceptual and so on when you're in academia. I've always tried to bring both together. Anyway, we have 4 paintings by Clara Peeters, or Peeters, as the Flemings pronounce her name. Remember that we talk about Flemish painting. When we do that, we refer to paintings made in what is now roughly equivalent to Belgium. Antwerp, Ghent, Bruges, Brussels, and so on. So the Prado has 4 paintings by her, and that's more than anyone else. She's not incredibly productive, but somewhat, and she sold paintings to high clients back in her life, and 4 of them ended in the Spanish Royal Collection. That's why they're now at the Prado. So in 2016, we decided to have the first show ever devoted to her as a monographic show, which was really a great event, really fun. Well, just doing exhibitions is great fun. I mean, you end up in this great place between art-loving public, full of curiosity and great artworks, and you're kind of the middle person there. So what I decided to do at a certain point, about 2.5 years before the show, is start learning about it and seeing
Becoming
what
her
had
friend.
been said. Yeah, and exactly, becoming acquainted. But also you enter a dialogue in which you're listening to her art and trying to decide or feeling. It happens very naturally what is of interest to me, and it would have been different if you had done it or anyone else. And I really started with a great curiosity about her biography. and the place in the world of women who wanted to be artists back then and so on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We know very little about her, as is often the case with women artists back then. And I ended up being led to where I usually end, which is just to her art. And I was struck by how beautiful it is, but that's a gross generalization. But what is peculiar about her form of beauty, the beauty that she created, and also cultural and material history, what these paintings show us and why they show us what they do show us. So it's been an adventure. And then just a couple of years ago, I think now maybe three, Lon Humphreys asked me to write this volume.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very happy to do that. And that's why we're here.
Yes. Can we show the covers again? Because I want to put you on the spot right away. So you say
Okay,
both these paintings are in the Prado Museum, right? They're both by
right.
her. Why do you know they are by her?
Well, these are two details. Okay, well, what we're looking at two, I would say, kind of one third of each painting. Well, I think I would now recognize these as by her anywhere I saw them. Or, there's both the back of that book you're holding and the back of the book I'm holding also have other paintings. There's a there's a precision, subject matter, and precision in the treatment of form and objects that are very clearly for one who has learned about these things of the second generation of still life painters. So that would place these works about 1610, 1620, not later than that. That's one thing. And then within the still fairly small group of people working in still life paintings, you just learn to identify her versus others. I would say there's a precision that is different from the dominant artistic language in Antwerp, which is where she paints.
Mm-hmm.
Antwerp art becomes a little bit old-fashioned, which I see as a quality, not the opposite,
Right.
because it is so dominated by Rubens that until Rubens dies in 1640, there's a certain lushness and exuberance, which is typical of his art. And most artists who want to be successful, Anthony Van Dyck, Franz Snyders, who is, roughly her contemporary and does still lifes, they have to be very luscious and very formally very rich. She's different. She's more in line with, the early stages of what our historians call naturalism, a type of realism that is typical of the 17th century that we identify with Caravaggio maybe.
Yeah.
Caravaggio's Basket of Fruit is a very good. It's earlier. That's really first generation still life painting. Exactly. We don't know the exact date of that, but say 1595, 97 or so. That's in the Pinacoteca Ambrosiana in Milan. And that is, that painting something that looks like something very common and calling attention to its qualities without seeming to put a loudspeaker to them. And it's not a matter of which of these aesthetics one likes more. I like them both, but it's a matter of pointing to differences. So I think Caravaggio starts a new aesthetic, and Rubens kind of resists that. And Antwerp painters need to follow Rubens because he's by far the most successful painter in the city, but also in all of Europe. She is more attuned to this more, I think the word may be pioneering or avant-garde, maybe one could have called it at the time. So she's kind of in a way going in a smallest city, big city for the time, about maybe 100,000 people, but a fairly small city. She's going against the predominant artist, but in doing so, she's following broader European trends. So many interesting things to talk about when one talks about art.
Right. Especially saying that a woman goes against the trend. I like that idea. I want to just mention a little brief story about this still life, Caravaggio still life. I have a reproduction of this in my house in Santander that I bought when I went to Italy. So it's because it is a striking picture. And I love, you talk about this idea that she follows this avant-garde trend in the last chapter, right? When you are assessing her place in the context of her life. And I just think it's incredible that you were able to intertwine all these things from really just very scarce biographical data, but more so about analyzing everything that her art represents, from what she's representing to the way she's representing it to even the evolution of her style that you see, because some of her paintings are dated, some of them are not. And you have to tell viewers that sometimes we know it's her because she signs her own pictures.
That's right. She almost always gives us a clue of these paintings being by her.
Mm-hmm.
Often, obviously, she signs her name and often follows it with a date. These
Mm-hmm.
Prado pictures are dated 1611, 12. In other cases, she includes a knife, and on the side of the knife, it says Clara Peeters, as if it was part of the silverware decoration, but it's
Yeah.
her name.
Yeah.
And in yet other cases, she includes tiny little reflected self-portraits in some of the objects that are represented in her paintings. I guess the best
Yes.
thing for our listeners to look into this is to type Clara Peeters and Google her and find paintings by her. But in different metal objects, she incorporates tiny little reflective self-portraits. In some cases, depending on whether it's the concave or convex part of a jug, she's upside down or not. So she
Yes.
clearly has a will to be seen. She wants to show herself. She's the author of these things. It's interesting for me to remind all of us that Jan van Eyck in the 1430s, he included reflective self-portraits in two pictures. He's one of the real greats in all the history of art. And when one says that, what do you mean by the word great? Well, he really is a trendsetter and establishes also standards that contribute to how great the art of painting will be for 400 or 500 years, no
He
less.
looks pretty great in his self-portraits too.
Incredible. But nobody else, I mean, a few artists, but very few. I mean, I've counted a couple only do it until she does, which is
Yeah.
weird because in fact, one thing I did when working on this book is I polished some silverware or metalware to see if you can see yourself, and yes, you can. So it's
Oh, so she was really representing what's the reality. She's
well,
in front
who
of this
knows?
jug. Well, she wants to like trick us into thinking that. And then she
Maybe
manages to put her portrait in there.
right. But what I thought was interesting, the question that popped into my mind, that's what I think is fun about being a historian. Questions are always popping into your mind, and
Mm-hmm.
you decide which to follow, which not, or you have time, or they fit into your professional life. But I'm now curious about so all the other artists made a big effort not to include their reflective self-portraits and metal objects because you can actually see them when they're painting. So if you see a still life with a jug and the artist is not reflected in it,
Mm-hmm.
he's making a point of painting himself out of the image. So I guess for artists, it was maybe too arrogant. They probably thought, I'm not going to sell this if I include myself. Well, she didn't worry about that. She wanted to be seen.
I like that. I love that she wanted to be seen because it was so difficult. And that brings me to the idea that really Antwerp and the whole, it's a bit complicated for people sometimes to understand what Flanders, the Netherlands, Dutch. I don't know if you can explain a little bit the difference between
Yeah,
all those things, because I think for a lot of people it's very complicated to understand that she's Flemish and not Dutch and all these
yeah,
things, first of all, because I think that I even get confused sometimes. So I think the listeners will appreciate that. And then how this is really something she's I mean, she's underprivileged because she's a woman, so she doesn't have access to things that men have in terms of artistry. But then she grows into becoming an artist in a place where women have had
yeah,
some experiences with that. Other artists, other encounters between
yeah.
famous artists and famous women artists like Susanna Harmwood, for example, which the listeners will know I'm very interested about. So could you start with the Flemish Dutch idea
Yeah,
and
it
then
is.
talk a bit
It's
more
very
about the precedents in her time
in
from
terms of
Clara Peeters?
to clarify the terms. Flemish art is the term we use for art made in what is now Belgium, more roughly Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that most art in Europe is art understood as a luxury product, all art that we now see in museums.
Yeah.
Most of it is made in two places, two nations that didn't exist back then. One is Italy, one is Belgium. Italian art or Flemish art. Um, Later on, about her time, during her lifetime, the Netherlands became an independent country. Belgium was part of the Netherlands.
Right.
And there was a northern part, which now is called the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
Painting from there, we call Dutch painting. Painting from the southern part, which is what we now call Belgium, we call Flemish art, Flemish painting. So just simply, I think to make things easy, when you hear about Dutch art, which is irrelevant to us here, you're talking about art made for the current day Kingdom of the Netherlands, which includes Holland, but also other provinces, Zeeland and Friesland and so on, seven
So the
provinces.
Rijksmuseum, for example, right?
Rijksmuseum is in Amsterdam. That's Dutch art. If you go south of the border, Belgium, that's Flemish art. All of that we call Netherlandish art if it's 14th and 15th century. I mean,
Right.
15th and 16th, sorry. And then what came from Belgium, Flemish art, and what came from Italy is what most people in Europe wanted to buy. So
Right.
someone working in Antwerp, this is important, was someone working in Antwerp making paintings in the early 17th century when she does, is working for a export market of luxury goods.
Mm-hmm.
They have been doing this in Antwerp since about 1510, about 100 years before her.
Mm-hmm.
Antwerp has become the leading producer of paintings as luxury goods for export. So I like to think of, the city full of merchants that are dealing with all kinds of products, mining products coming from Germany and the Netherlands. I mean, and Scandinavia, wool coming from Spain and England, different things. Things are coming in from all parts of the world and being redistributed from Antwerp to all of Europe from the early 16th century onwards. 1540, about 80 years before her, the first permanent gallery for selling paintings opens in all of Europe.
Oh,
This means that you don't only go to a painter's studio,
yeah.
or that you don't only expect the yearly, the annual market, annual fair to go buy something, but that at any time of the year you can go to a big art gallery and look for paintings that are there in stock. So that shows how prominent and how much Antwerp is a leader of the art producing world in the 16th and early 17th century. The greatest example of this success is Rubens, of course, who not only is the painter of kings and all this stuff, but also has a huge workshop with a lot of people working for them. And imagine this full of traders and people packing and people making the boxes and people dealing with the insurance and the shipping. And it's a big industry. She's part of that. We know that in the 17th century, so a little bit after her lifetime, but not much, two of her works are in the Spanish Royal Collection. And we don't know how they get there. They
In
don't,
Madrid?
in Madrid, yeah, they've already made it to the largest, most important collection of paintings in Europe at the time. Two of her works have made it there. But
And
we
they
don't know
were
how they make it
exhibited?
there. They were there in the inventories. They're listed in the
Mhm.
Royal Palace. Yeah, two of the two others are about 100 years later. But what that tells us is that she's probably being sold by art dealers, but being sold to the highest and the high-end collectors of the time.
Yeah, because the second set was owned by Queen Isabel of Farnesio, no? The
The
Queen.
second set is incorporated into the Royal Collection in the 18th century, which is, it's similar, a great collection looking for great art, but it's more relevant to us what happens in the 17th century just because it's closer to her time,
Mhm.
and it allows us to understand who she has in mind when she's painted. And that's a high-end art market.
And if you're saying that she's a pioneer in the still life industry and that kind of emergence of that genre in painting, but she's not the first woman artist we have a record of, really, in Antwerp, isn't it? Because there's a very famous encounter in 1521 between Dura and Susanna Horenboot, who was also a Flemish artist from Ghent, but they meet in Antwerp.
Well, by then Antwerp has taken over. Ghent and Bruges, a little bit south and west if you go to Belgium now. Beautiful cities, by the way, great part of the world to visit.
It
They have
is.
been the leading art centers in that part of Europe for a while. And Antwerp takes over about 1510, 1515. And artists simply move there, and we don't know exactly why. And an economist has pointed to the fact that they seem to have more open guild regulations. In
Mm.
Bruges, for example, we know of a early 16th century painter, Yara David. He is registered in the guild in Bruges, and he's allowed to register in the guild of painters in Antwerp as well. Bruges is not allowing painters from other cities to register there. So Antwerp seems to be opening up and creating the context for a thriving painting industry. And they managed to do it. And by 15 or 20, they are far and away the leading artistic center, not only in what is now Belgium, but probably in all of Europe. Only Venice, Florence could compete with them.
I know a little bit about this period time you're talking about, the 1510s, especially because in England, something is happening. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon are building up their navy because Henry VIII participates in 1513 in the war of the League of Cambrai with Emperor Maximilian I in northern France. And then he takes Tournai and Therouanne. And after he has the bombs between Margaret of Austria, who is the governor of this area that we're talking about, and England become very, very tight-knit. And there's presence of artists that are working for Henry VIII in Antwerp in 1514, for example, Vincent Volpe, who is known to be from Naples and probably arrives via the way that Sebastian Cabot arrives, sent by Ferdinand of Aragon to Catherine in England, comes to Antwerp to get a lot of stuff because they're doing not just these magnificent paintings, but all the timber for a lot of events that they're doing in England, because they're doing a lot of parties, really, and they need a lot of architectures and a lot of arts and there's a blossom of the arts in the court of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon that is linked to the relationship with the court of Margaret of Austria. We've talked about the exchanges of portraits. I was reading about, for example, when you were talking about the significance and symbolism of things like the rosemary, that portrait of Charles V, when he's not Charles V yet, in the Royal Collection in England, he's holding a branch of rosemary because he's going to be married to the sister of Henry VIII. So I think probably this is why Susanna, who then ends up in England working for Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, is in Antwerp meeting Dürer, because she's probably not only a painter but also an agent. We know that, for example, Levina, one of Levina Turnlich's sisters, was an artistic agent. She was trading with art.
It's fairly common. A good number of artists
Yeah.
throughout the periods that you and I study, and I imagine later on, but certainly in the 16th and 17th centuries, a number of artists are dealers also. And usually that is precisely because they go to major courts that are very wealthy from places where art is best. So, Pompeo Leoni comes from Milan to Madrid and to Valladolid and to work for Philip II, and he's dealing, and that's why you have some Leonardo drawings still in the National Library in Madrid. He's bringing great Italian art to Spain so that the market will buy it. It's another way of making money. I was thinking, listening to you and to the links between the English court and art made in Antwerp. Well, Margaret of Austria, you mentioned, she's from Malines, which is another great city that I forgot to mention, another one of these great artistic centers, great place to visit also. Halfway, if you take a train now from Brussels to Antwerp, Malines is kind of halfway. I was thinking as you were mentioning that, if one comes to all this from art, and one is an art lover like we all are, that's why we're interested in these things, and we love a lot of other things, but art is pretty central. I love the idea that for kings and queens and people in power back then, having the best artists they could have mattered a lot. I mean, Isabel of Castile wants Juan de Flanders. We don't know who he is, but he's obviously John of Flanders. Mm-hmm. And he wants him because he's just better than Joe Schmo from Burgos or from wherever. That's
he paints a portrait of Catherine of Aragon. We all know that.
Right. And it's great that, that it mattered to them. And this idea of, this goes back to the book of What is Quality in Art. You go back to Jan van Eyck in the early 15th century. Mm-hmm. He is so good. I mean, I am always taken by how he paints in the eyebrows of Moses. I think it is on the top of the Ghent polyptych in a place you're never going to see it. He paints these white eyebrows. Yeah. I mean, his standards are so high, mm-hmm. so exacting that he's just going to do an incredible job, even where nobody's going to see it. And the art of his time, of his place, remains that great for a long, long time. And thanks to that, kings from England and the Queen of Spain and they all want these great artists to come and work for them. They're not satisfied with local talent. They want the best they can get. A lot of it in the 16th and 17th century comes from Antwerp.
Yeah, and listening to you now, thinking that not only Vincent Volpe, who's from Naples, but Pietro Torrigiano, who broke Michelangelo's nose,
who made what is, this is saying a lot. This is only a headline, but the best sculpture in Spain still now. I mean, this is only a headline. You could argue that Chillida, Picasso, whatever. But there's the Saint Jerome and the Museo de Bellas Artes in Seville by Torrigiano, which is to die for, made in clay and painted. Incredible, yeah. Well, they get the same thing.
Michelangelo made fun of his sculptures. I think he got a bit upset and broke his nose. That's why he had to leave Florence, went to Rome to work in San Giacomo degli Spagnoli, so working for Spanish patrons, but then goes to Margaret of Austria as a soldier. So there's a lot of Italians, high talented Italians that are there too. In your book, I was surprised of how much interaction between Antwerp and Milan there is, but also how all these experiences and all this very high quality art in Antwerp influences really the art of Clara Peeters, right?
Yeah,
She inherits this from Susanna, because you mentioned Susanna and Lavina as these people who are highly qualified. Maybe for another episode would be like, why in this time women go to courts? It's because it's a necessity for them, and Lavina becomes a woman that I think she's very underrated because she's the first one to receive salary and to be appointed as paintrix of the king, Henry VIII. So it's just incredible that women, I think it's because of all these workshops and these the elimination of
yeah,
manuscripts and this tradition that they were just, and let's be honest, because they had fathers that believed in them and
right.
allowed them and educated them. So the power of education again, and of someone believing in you and showing you a trade that you have to learn, because that's another thing that I really liked about your book, how you show her the evolution of her art, because they're dated. You see a
Right.
difference in the way she's depicting things, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you see how she gets better, like we all do, in our life at whatever we do. Yeah, I was going to say that privilege stacks up in different ways. So a lot of women were very privileged. I mean,
Yes, yes,
if you were the daughter of a noble person, then you
yes.
had a great privilege over a lot of other people, and you could paint. In her case, we don't know, and most likely she was from a family of painters, like a lot of artists were at
Yeah,
the time, and that was another way to circumvent restrictions and so on. And we can imagine that she could paint because she could be trained at home, get
yeah.
contracts through her family members and so on. I was going to say, and a good example of this idea that I like lately, and someday maybe I'll write about it, of these milestones that create these very high standards. I
Mm-hmm.
like the idea that the art of painting has been incredibly successful for 400 or 500 years. It won't be so in the future. It wasn't that way in the
Mm-hmm.
distant past. But it did really well for a while. One of them is a man called Simon Benning, who is a specialist in miniatures, and his daughter is another very important famous painter. And Simon Benning, who paints mainly in Bruges in his case, sometimes in Antwerp, but mainly in Bruges, he paints a little self-portrait, tiny little miniature.
Yes.
And there's two versions. One's at the Met in New York, one at the V&A in London, and they're
Yeah.
both very similar. And I think it's 1578,
Mm-hmm.
and it says how old he is. No, 1550 something. He's 78 years of age. You can look him up in Google also.
Yeah.
I remember when it's very symbolic to me because you have later painters in the 17th century painting galleries of art collections, and sometimes you see this tiny little miniature self-portrait by Simon Benning somewhere around there.
Oh, you
So
do.
they
Like
highlight
Wally. Look for Waldo.
exact that his self-portrait matters. It's one of the images that
Okay.
gives the art of painting status. But then I get curious, as happened to me with her paintings, with what you see there, and you see he's holding glasses with his left hand.
Mm-hmm.
Glasses don't have this. What do you call this part of the glass? The stem or something? I don't know.
Yes,
The glasses,
I
which
suppose.
were an Italian invention from the 13th century, but he's holding them. He needs to work really close up. He has a little muscle cell on his table where he would keep gold or some materials for his paintings, shell gold, they call gold, that were
Yeah.
used in paintings. And he's paid attention to all the stuff that he needs so that he can illuminate or paint these tiny little images. And I was drawn to what she's showing us in her paintings, and it all has to do with kind of high-end culture, imitating court culture, wanting to look fancy and so on.
She seems to
Um,
inherit like a self-esteem from these previous women artists, like Lavina Turnley you were talking about now. I wanted to mention something that I read because there's a lot of there's been people proposing that maybe Nicholas Hilliard, the great miniaturist from the time of Elizabeth I of England, could have been trained by Lavina Turnerlake, who lives until the 1570s in London. And he's one of the first ones to talk about the art of limbing or miniature paintings. And he says something that I thought you would like to hear. He says, for limning, there is also an excellent white to be made of quicksilver, which draweth a very fine line. This is what the women painters use. So he's mentioning specifically the women painters. I've thought a lot about this, and I think it's just if you apply common sense, women's hands are usually smaller too. So these miniatures, we have to realize these paintings are super small. First of all, you need really good eyesight, really good coordination between your hands and your eyesight. And so these women are also peaking very early on, because Susanna, for example, Hornboot is 18 when she meets Jura, and he buys a Savior, a little religious painting of Christ, so a portrait really, and well, an idealized portrait of Christ. She's already peaking. She's already famous at this point.
And that's unusual. Painters usually are not like musicians who can be great at a very young age. If you think about the entire history of painting, Picasso, Dürer is an example, but very few painters are great when they're very young. It takes a while to learn how to paint well. So yeah, I don't know, but that is a very curious statement. Why would one associate a certain material to the way women paint? I don't know, and not anything. I mean, I know of that book, but of that text, but I don't know enough. I was thinking, I have a dentist who's about 6'9" or something, and his hands are big, and he does fine inside my mouth.
Wow, it's crazy that he's so tall. That's a very tall person, and especially being a dentist, he probably has a lot of back pain nowadays. But I was thinking a lot about how Clara seems to inherit this self-esteem, because you do find her self-reflected portraits that are like miniatures, really. If you think about it, they're about the same size as a miniature portrait. And there seems to be a connection between the women and portraiture that I'm really interested about. And I just love yesterday. I'll tell a little anecdote. Yesterday, when I was preparing for this, I showed my daughter Susan some Clara Peeters drawings from the Prado, and we were trying to find the little portraits, and she got so excited. She spotted a few. There's one of the paintings that has at least 7 or 8 of these.
I think it has 8. Yeah, one has 8.
That's a lot.
Well, I don't know if we can find it now. Yeah.
We'll put it in the. We'll make sure that the image is projected too. So
also make sure that for our public, make sure you look for miniatures in Google, 15th or 16th century miniatures by Simone Benning or Lavinia Turnerlake or others, because it's such a gorgeous art form. It takes this kind of, I don't know, it's a great way to leave the world and kind of become absorbed by an art form.
And then it's so connected to the amazing art of illumination. And I was thinking that's the connection also with Clara and her passion for drawing these flowers that are just out of this world. There's one of her paintings in the Met that, I was looking at for a good solid minute. And then there's another little painting that she does on copper that has insects around it.
That's right.
That's very linked to the illumination of manuscripts. And that brings us again back to the place where she's painting, right?
Let me add to that something. When we're talking about a genealogy that ends up in the production of a new kind of art form, which is still life paintings didn't exist until the very, very, very late 1590s or so, very late 16th century. And the reason why they exist, there's an economic reason, which is there's a growing demand, more money, more palaces, more houses, and some artists come up with a new product to make money and to have a career. So what used to be a little detail in a painting of the Virgin and Child, maybe with a little flower on the side or a pot of flowers, now the guy or the woman who made those flowers, now I'm going to do a whole painting of this and see if I can sell it. And they succeeded. So that's one thing to remember. But another one, as part of this genealogy, it's like a cocktail with a lot of different influences creating a new drink. Another thing that matters is scientific illustrations.
Oh, yes.
In the mid 16th century, there's a boom of research, it's fair to call it, being done on new animals and trees and so on that has to do with the European presence in America and other parts of the world. But there's an interest in new things, and there's a new, more scientific point of view instead of simply describing a tree or a cat or an animal according to the way the ancients did. Now people are looking anew.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, they need imaging technology like we do now. But instead of using a CAT scan or something, they use artists.
Yes.
And these artists, for the most part, or let's say this kind of scientific imaging becomes an Antwerp specialty at about 1550, 1560. So suddenly artists who are good at painting or drawing usually, or making prints of a fish, but it has to be perfectly described so that one can, it's about describing so that you can recognize the features of a
Mm-hmm.
fish or a flower or whatever. Those painters can make a living in Antwerp. So those painters are also doing other paintings. We don't know who they are for the most part, but we know some names. But that kind of art form influences her. And we don't have a document that says this, but precision being so important to her, I think it's a clear link to this previous generation of I'm going to get a job and make a living if I can be very precise in how I describe an animal, a tree, a plant, a fish, or whatever it is.
Well, talking about this, Rebecca is going to love this anecdote that I'm going to tell now because you were speaking about examples of miniature portraits. One of the first miniature portraits rendered in England by the Hornboots is a picture of Catherine of Aragon with the monkey from America,
Right.
an American monkey. I call him Granado. I met this monkey. I don't know.
Did you make up the name? You made
I
it
did.
up?
I did. Just because the
They have
pomegranate
names.
granada is Catherine of Aragon's symbol. Another one of the fruits that Clara Peeters reproduces in her paintings because it's such a great fruit to reproduce. It's so lush, right? The pomegranate. But in the case of this monkey, it's really the first reproduction of a portrait of someone in England with an American monkey. And this has to be in the 1520s. So this is early on. And then, for example, I was thinking while you were talking about this new type of art from the still life, that painting you have in the Prado by a follower of Gerard David, who is one of these guys who's the leading miniaturist, by probably someone like Simon Benning, where there's a little pot that looks very
Right.
similar
Yeah.
to the pots
That
that
that becomes
Clara,
it. Yeah,
right.
that becomes a specialty. Some people paint those flower pots and they become still life painters. I was thinking when you were talking about these monkeys show up in several paintings by Clara
Yes,
Peeters.
yes.
So, we see artichokes, we see monkeys, we see certain kind of Venetian glass. There's certain items that become a status symbol, and she includes them in her works. And monkeys remind me of, the Habsburgs after Charles and especially Philip II, second half of the 16th century, clearly based in Spain, have somewhat of a monopoly in cultural terms
Yeah.
over exotic things coming from Africa or America.
Mm-hmm.
Africa, because remember, the Portuguese kingdom is incorporated by Philip II into the Spanish crown and stays there until 1640. So Philip II, third and fourth. And so, there's people in Antwerp are looking at Spain for exotic animals that then become kind of household pets and symbols of status. The woman who rules over Clara Peeters and Belgium, what we now call Belgium, over the southern Netherlands or Flanders or whatever, what we now call Belgium, is Isabel Clara Eugenia, sister, daughter of Philip II, daughter of Anne of Austria, who has a great woman painter as one of her chamber ladies, no, Sofonis Banguisola.
Mm-hmm.
She portrays herself with monkeys as pets, and she writes a letter once saying that she's seen a monkey in Belgium, and she says it reminds me of the one that ran loose and broke the organ in the Escorial. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So she's remembering a time at which a pet that they must have had on leash got loose and broke
Right.
this major, musical instrument inside the major basilica of the Escorial. Another anecdote. Well, all this goes to material culture, what we learn about the past by studying paintings
Mm-hmm.
and what paintings share with simply collecting items, animals. Rubens was in Spain twice, roughly a contemporary of Clara Peeters, maybe a little bit older, but roughly a contemporary. One of the times when he comes, he writes to a friend in England, actually, a friend in England, and he tells him, "You told me to look into perfume." And he says, "I don't find anything exotic here now." So he's been told, since you're going to Madrid, look for exotic perfumes.
Right.
And he says, but the ship from Goa hasn't arrived yet. It's now stopped in Angola. As soon
Mm,
as it arrives in Madrid, I'll see what I can find in it.
right.
So, you know, the Antwerp produces paintings for high-end clients around Europe. Madrid and Lisbon and Seville receive exotic goods from Asia and America, which are then redistributed through
Right.
Habsburg networks all over Europe. So all these networks of items, things, high end, because that's why we know about them, because these people were powerful. Clara Peters is part of that same thing. She reflects it in her paintings, but her paintings themselves are also collected and shipped around in the same way.
That's incredible. I was thinking about another fact that I know. A letter from Santo Domingo in 1517 sent to Catherine of Aragon, someone who had been his secretary, because the first bishop in America was Alexandro Geraldini, Catherine of Aragon's former teacher, who was the first bishop in America, in Santo Domingo. And her other secretary, who was there with him, sends her a letter and says, "I'm sending you this cacique chair and this cacique headdress. I would send you parrots and monkeys and other animals, but I'm afraid this English friar who is going back home because he can't stand the weather here in Santo Domingo, can't blame the guy. He is actually, I don't know if he's going to care for them very well." Because what this guy really wants is to come to England to serve Catherine, really. He
Right,
wants to get out of Santo Domingo one way or another.
right,
So he's
right.
sending her some gifts. So people, when we talk about Sebastian Cabot, the guy in Santo Domingo sending Catherine Aragon a chair, the Vincent Volpe going to Antwerp for Catherine and Henry, all these things, it's going back to the idea that, yeah, they're attracting this type of these artists. And then at the time of Isabel Clara Eugenia, there seems to be a revival with that because she's clearly a very
I think it's the
influential
same era.
patron, and
It's
she's
really the
clearly who
same
is
era, I
moving
think.
things around at that time, right?
Think about globalization. It's clearly a key concept that helps understand that era. We think of it in our own times, but this is the 16th, 17th century are very much defined by globalization, and Antwerp is a hub and later on Amsterdam takes over from them in the 17th century, but in the 16th century, early 17th, Antwerp is a hub, and they receive goods and redistribute them. But there are other hubs, Lima and
Yeah.
Mexico City and Seville, Lisbon, very especially, and Madrid also. And so it's fun to see these things in that way.
I'm going
I
to
was
put you on the
look,
spot to kind of finish
okay.
up because I know you're extremely busy. So Isabel Clara Eugenia and Clara Peters, oh, they seem to share a name. Do you think there was ever a connection between these two women that shared a space, that shared a passion for art? You certainly mention a lot of Isabel Clara Eugenia in the book, but what do you think? Do you think she ever knew about the art of Clara Peters?
Okay, I'm going to do what we always do. Rather than answer you, I'm going to go my own way. No,
Okay.
I think not, but we don't know the answer. I'll tell you why. Well, first, I wanted her to be named after Isabel Clara Eugenia, but she was born before when Isabel Clara Eugenia must have been about 15 when the painter was born,
Oh,
and she
I
was
see.
still in Madrid and not she wasn't. She became
It's a nice
ruler of
thought. It was a nice thought.
she became ruler only in 1598.
Right.
Rubens' daughter, one of his daughters is named Clara, and she is named after the Infanta, pretty much for sure, because his son
Yeah.
is named Albert, and his godfather is Isabel Clara Eugenia's husband, Albert. Anyway, but I'll tell you what is my take on that, what that relationship reveals. We don't know that she collected anything by her. Her paintings reflect a culture based on elite collecting as defined by her and her father and brother Philip III and so on. Clearly, so it's we're talking about an elite culture, so they're related there. But Isabel Clara Eugenia clearly favors Rubens and Jan Bruegel the Elder, especially.
Mm-hmm.
And Jan Bruegel the Elder paints pretty much every single thing she paints, he paints in his paintings too. A bird for falconry, or an artichoke, or pheasants, or
Just to
different.
interrupt you 1 second, isn't Jan Bruegel the one who has a grandmother who's a miniaturist?
That's right. That's right.
Oh, back to the women artists.
And who teaches him? Well, she's his teacher, according to sources
Okay,
back
so
then too.
education again
Yeah.
and art are connected. Yes.
But I think what I became interested in this relationship between is the court in Brussels, Isabel Clara Eugenia and her taste, versus her, Clara Peeters in Antwerp,
Mm-hmm.
is that Jan Bruegel represents a more elite and more old-fashioned, in the sense of very clearly linked to the art of illumination, the art of painting illuminated manuscripts, which is what he's been educated as. He's closer to that aesthetic, which
Mm-hmm.
means more saturated color, less natural. It looks more designed.
Idealistic.
It's more
Idealized.
artsy. I
Yeah.
would say artsy, more stylized. I would say
Mm-hmm.
the transformation between reality and art is greater. It departs more from the way things look. And he is incredible to me. I mean, my kids always say, "You say the best artist in the world is a bunch of different artists." Well, he's definitely one of them to me.
Okay.
Jan Bruegel. He paints a lot with Rubens, and he's amazing. But she favors that aesthetic, and there's clear signs of that because of what she collects and what she sends her brother Philip III and her
Mm-hmm.
nephew later on Philip IV in Spain. Her art, there's one case where an elite, an aristocrat from the Brussels court is told by an agent that he can buy paintings by a man called Van Hoestonk, who is very similar to Clara Peeters. And so they're kind of a second generation still
Mm-hmm.
life painter, very precise. Reminds me of this kind of scientific aesthetic that comes
Right.
from the late 16th century. And he says, I wrote this down to
You
make
call it
sure I
the
could say it.
understated elegance, right?
That's right, but very precise.
Yeah.
And I think they're beautiful, I think.
Yeah,
And
I love them.
he says his heart about Hoesdonk, who I take as being similar to Clara Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And their paintings do look quite alike. They're very typical of this small group of still life painters from Antwerp. And this aristocrat says his art is clean, but it lacks liveliness. And to me, liveliness is what Rubens brings to art. It's the sense of an overflowing of life. She's not like that. She's about precision and an understated kind of beauty. And she's really sensitive to relating a tone here with a tone there. And, there's a formal beauty that does not come from a sense of formal plenitude, but from a
Mm-hmm.
different kind of from rhyming, more,
Very
imagine different
demure.
poets. There are poets that are luscious and poets that are understated. And there's
Yeah.
different things. We live in a great time in the sense that we can now enjoy everything. We can be eclectic. But this aristocrat reminds us that something clean but lacking liveliness was not of his taste.
Right.
I can imagine, we'll never know, but I can imagine Isabel Clara Eugenia saying something similar.
Well, you know what? I think the art of Clara Peters people like it a lot because it's very Instagrammable. Come on,
Yeah,
it's super cool. I think. I mean, I thought the book was
it's
amazing.
gorgeous. Show me that cover again because I love look at how elegant. I mean, she that the to see from those flowers, you see a stem, a very
Mm-hmm.
simple green little leaf as being.
But kind of frames, almost
And
like
it
makes it
is
look
it
like
is
even
so
like a
she's so
fountain.
elegant.
And you mentioned that she might have owned some of these objects
She
because they
must,
appear.
yeah, own them, or she would have at least, like all artists did, she would at least have a little book where she would have drawn items so she could repeat them in different places. Yeah.
I think that exact thing that just mentioned is one of the keys that I am working on a lot. How these books that the artists have then not only they use for their works, but then are given to other artists. So when an artist like, I'm delving a little bit into the 17th century when someone like Rubens or Van Dyck goes to England. What is he seeing? What is he copying? What is he, it's just fascinating. I thought it was a really good read for the summertime. And it's not that often that you find a book about a woman artist that is just based on really on what she painted. because you don't have
That's
that much
right.
information about her
But
life.
not only that, I mean, that's one reason, of course, but the main reason is that, I'm drawn to the art mainly.
Hmm.
Sometimes I think it doesn't matter to me who makes something unless who makes it allows me to understand part of what I'm enjoying, what I really like. So that's not to say that every point of view is valid in art history as long as it deals with art in some way. But I do really feel that for what I like, my passion is the art and everything else stems from there. And you're right, the book is mainly about these paintings, but through them we learn about all these things we've been talking about. We're so lucky to be art historians, really. We can talk about whatever we want,
That's
pretty
true.
much.
Great compliment to what is quality in art. So you can get both. We'll put it in the show notes. I want to thank Alejandro for coming. It was great to talk to you about all these things. I have like a million more questions, but I know your time is limited. Maybe you could come to the show some other time.
I would
I don't
love
know,
to. Thank you.
any exhibitions, anything in the Prado this summer that people need to get excited about, Alejandro?
I can't say right now. You know what I would
Any
where I would like
recommendations for someone going to the Prado this summer?
where I would like to go right now is to the Met in New York. They have a Caspar David Friedrich show, and
Oh,
early 19th century romantic landscape. That's one of the heights of art, of the history of art, as are so many others.
that's great.
In the
Well, you have
Prado,
to have
this
be a world traveler if you want to be an updated art historian, for sure. Going to New York, that'll be great because I'm going to actually to New Haven, Connecticut this fall. So when is it? When is
to
the
the British Art
show
Center. I don't
running?
know. It won't be there in the fall because it was first in Hamburg and it's been in New York for a little while. But you're going to go to one of the great buildings in the 20th century in the States, Louis Kahn Building,
Yes, just
next to
renewed.
the original Yale Art Gallery, which is by Louis Kahn as well, and great collection of Van Dycks and so on. You're going to be in a great place. Yeah.
Yeah, so I send
Congratulations for that.
a big hi to the Yale Center for British Art. I can't wait to be there later this year. Thank you so much for coming, Alejandro. Have a great day,
Thank you,
everyone.
Emma. Thank you so much. Bye bye.